Hello, dear design leaders, future thinkers, change makers from around the world. I'm Ekaterina, co-founder of Future London Academy, and welcome to another Woman Cozy conversation about design, creativity, leadership, business, and everything in between. And today we have an incredible guest, a very, very special guest who sits in the perfect intersection between creativity and business. Wonderful, amazing, super talented Jim Pryor. Jim has been a CEO for over 25 years, seems like, and worked and led some of the most influential and famous branding and design consultancies across the world, including starting his CEO career at the Partners, super iconic London agency that I at some point dreamt to work for. So it was the place to be. And then Jim moved to Superunion, again, another iconic, very well-known brand consultancy, creative agency, and recently merged with Design Bridge and Partners. So Jim was part of leadership in this acquisition merger, and now Jim is enjoying all sorts of other leadership things outside of the world of branding agencies and WPP. But we are incredibly lucky today to have Jim because we will talk about all things of design, leadership. How do you show the value of creativity in the boardrooms? What do CEOs care about? And how do CEOs think and make decisions, whether it is from Jim's personal experience of being CEO or all the board members and CEOs that Jim had to work with throughout his career? Welcome, Jim. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. But no, it's super exciting to be here. Pleasure to be with you, Ekaterina. So it's great. Looking forward.
Great. And I would like to start with the first question that a lot of our community is asking about throughout this series that we are running about design in the boardroom. But in general, I feel like this is one of the hottest topic in creative and design world at the moment, which is how do you show the value of creativity and design to the boardrooms, to the CEOs, and what do they care about? How do they think? How should we as designers show it better, or what kind of language should we use? So I'll start with the first, I suppose, broader question. What do the boardroom and CEOs care about in the world of creativity and design from your experience?
Yeah, well, it's like such a great question, such a big question as well, right? And one that so many organizations are wrestling with all the time. There's an interesting phenomenon, I think, that we see in the world. When you go and you talk to senior leaders and CEOs and decision makers in large organizations, and you say to them, which are the organizations in the world that you most admire? Who would you most like to be like? You know, they will invariably talk about companies that are highly creative companies. You know, people talk for decades about Apple as being a great example. They'll talk about Google and their constant stream of innovation. They'll talk about, newer players maybe coming into the market, but always, the companies that people admire most are the most creative companies in the world. So, you have to kind of start, I think, in this conversation about creativity with the assumption and the justified assumption that, of course, CEOs and decision makers and leaders care about creativity, because what creativity is doing is driving innovation, it's driving advantage, it's driving distinctiveness in the marketplace versus other competitors. And who doesn't want that as a business leader? It's a really interesting topic. Throughout my career, I asked this question of so many people. We instigated surveys to ask business leaders this question. And every single time the answer comes back that says, of course, creativity is really important to my business. The problem is, they just don't know how to implement it, right? The problem that business leaders really have is they understand there's a need for creativity. What they don't know is, how do I actually execute and deliver against that inside of my business? What does it mean? We used to have this thing, we go back to the example of Apple, where you talk to companies and they say, I'd like to be more like Apple. And you say, do you understand what it takes to be more like Apple? Do you understand what it means to have a ruthless attention to detail? Do you understand what it means to be constantly innovating? Do you understand what it means to be disrupting the status quo on a constant basis? And say, I don't know. I don't know that I do. There'd be this phenomenon where you say to business leaders, how often do you talk about creativity in your leadership meetings? By the way, I think there's an interesting aside on this. The boardroom is not necessarily where you need creativity. The senior leadership team is where you need creativity, depending on the structure of a company. In a large company, the boardroom is very often, a less operationally focused area. It's more about kind of checking up and ensuring there are good business practices in place from a regulatory point of view as much as anything. But inside your senior leadership team, where the key executives sit inside of a business, where the key decision makers sit inside of a business, that's where you really need to have this conversation. So I think, back to the big question that you asked about what do senior leaders see as and the value of creativity? What do they want to know about creativity? It's not about the fact that it's important. They know that. It's about how do we do it? What do we need to do to execute? Most of the time, the people who sit around those senior leadership tables have no experience of it. They're not trained in it. They're trained in something else. Their careers haven't been spent in it. They've been spent pursuing a different channel. Very often, some people will come through that journey and they are the better CEOs, but very often they're not. And so the task at hand, if you are a creative professional looking to influence a senior leadership team or a board, for want of a better word, the key is to really have a conversation about what it means to do that. What are the practices? What are the techniques? What are the tools? What are the behaviors that will bring about results? But that it is important, I would say most people accept and is a given.
I love that there is already at least one positive news that the boardroom and CEOs actually do want creativity. And you're so right. I feel like everyone kind of intuitively wants creativity and gives these examples of Apple and Nike's ad campaigns when it was the early days of advertising, and all sorts of creative companies where you just want to be part of those teams, and Pixar and whatever that is in the head of overall audience. But you're right. I feel like there is no actual understanding what it takes to be creative. So you mentioned the sacrifices that you need to have to be a creative. So what kind of things maybe stop companies from being creative? What should they be prepared for? Of what kind of roadblocks they might face if they decide to put creativity and design at the center of the organization?
Yeah, well, it's, again, another great question. I mean, most companies, especially large companies, are naturally risk averse. And the bigger they get and the more successful they get, sometimes the more risk averse they become. And that's a problem for creativity, because creativity is very often about risk taking. At its heart is that willingness to be able to do something that you're not sure whether or not it's going to work or not. I mean, there are ways to modify that, but it is interesting that sometimes the principles of it are slightly opposed to the natural nature of businesses. I think there's a couple of things that are really important. I mean, I think when you go into a senior leadership team or a board environment, and what you can't do is just talk about creativity. Creativity as a word is such a big word. Like, what you've got to be much more specific about is, what does it mean? Does it mean that we're going to improve the quality of our product, for example? Does it mean that we're going to have a higher level of innovation and newness in our product mix? Does it mean that we're going to have better connections with our audiences, whether that's through advertising, through brand, through some kind of customer service engagement, or what it is? But I think the first thing is to be very clear and specific about what it is you are using creativity to influence and what outcome you're going to be focused on, because that very much inside of a board or a senior team, it's about outcome focus. It's, why is this good for the business? Well, it's good because we're going to have better product, which means we're going to sell more, or it's good because we're going to have a better connection with audiences that we've struggled to connect with before, and therefore we're going to sell more. It's good because it might be that the creativity is about how you improve the operational efficiency of the organization, and therefore it costs less to produce, and therefore it's good for profitability. Or it could be that creativity is just good for the retention of and motivation of talent, and it makes you a go-to destination for new hires and prospective hires who want to come into the organization. But that's, I mean, the starting point, I think, for any conversation has to be around, what does it influence that is of value to the business. And everybody understands that. Everybody understands the language of better sales, lower costs, more connected audiences, better, longer lifetime value, etc. So I think that's very much the starting point. And that's, I would say to anybody looking to go to a senior leadership team and say, how am I going to sell them on the idea of creativity? Don't necessarily go in and say, I'm here to sell you creativity. Go in and say, I'm here to sell you better product. I think that's probably where I would start.
That's a great point, and I feel like more and more designers and creatives now are aware of the fact that it has to be linked to the business results, as you said, whether it is revenue or costs or anything else that can demonstrate an impact, financial impact that creativity and design has on the business. On the flip side, it's all good, but as you said, it is a risk. It's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
And from my experience of talking to a lot of design leaders, what they say is that we sometimes are afraid to say, we will increase market share, we will do this, because there is no guarantee. And should we guarantee that we will do this by doing this, whatever, rebranding, whatever this is, the creative output that we are doing, should we guarantee it? And then what if we fail? Or how should we go about something that is, again, it's a risk?
Yeah, no, well, I think you have to start with, well, you certainly have to start with belief. I would say most stuff that gets pitched to a board, nobody knows for sure that it's going to work, right? It's not like there are other disciplines inside of the business that are coming in and saying, I can tell you for sure that this is going to deliver this result on the top line of the business in 3 months' time or 6 months' time. I mean, everything is a gamble. Everything is something of a risk. There arguably is a little bit more risk, I think, in creativity. So you've got to demonstrate belief. If what you try to do is to manufacture data that is going to prove your point, you might struggle. I mean, you've got to be very, very sure of your data if that's what you're going to do. But very often as a creative person, you're working in isolation of the data because it doesn't exist yet, right? If we're going to create something that isn't already out in the world, then of course there's no data to support that. There may be case studies and examples that you can gather from elsewhere, and they can be valuable. But very often, as I say, it's about belief. It's about having the confidence that this is going to work. And, the pitch needs to be around, this is how we're going to transform our business through this angle or this angle or this angle. And this is the confidence that I have that this is going to happen. Remember, again, what you're pitching against are other strategies inside of the business. If you're a CEO in a large organization, you're wrestling with priorities all the time. Everybody in your leadership team wants to spend money that you don't have, right? That's like everybody wants to. When you sit down at the beginning of the year and you say, right, or the end of the previous year, round about now, and you say, let's put the budgets together for 2026. You come to me and tell me what you'd like to do in 2026. Like your budget is like, 4 times over the limit by, at the first turn, because everybody's got a strategy that they want to implement. What you have to remember as a creative person is most of those other strategies that people are coming with, though, are about small incremental changes. And they're pathways that have been tried before, maybe worked a bit, maybe didn't work that much. They're not transformational inside of the business. Your advantage as a creative person, if you're coming in and saying, I have an idea about how we can create something radically new and better, is that the degree of change you might be able to bring about may be greater. So I think start with that confidence. Start with the point of view that you're going to make a major difference to the business. And if you're not, well, then you have to question whether or not your idea is good enough anyway, right? If your idea is not going to make a significant difference to the business, then you shouldn't be pitching it to the board. But if it is, go in, pitch it. And again, I think this is where you'll find that, there's a difference, I would say, there's a significant difference between the mindset of a CEO and the mindset of people who sit, maybe not always one level, but certainly 2 levels below the CEO. The CEO will be very receptive to an idea that is well thought through, that has high potential, that is imaginative, that is different, that's something they haven't heard before, something they haven't seen from their competitors before, and that makes instinctive sense. They'll be much more receptive to that than a lot of people imagine that they will be. So start there, aim high, and then see where you go. And if the response that you get is positive, the next steps and how you build it out will probably come quite naturally. If it isn't, then you go away, you rethink it. But aim high.
I love this aiming high philosophy and also starting with the confidence. I do believe that creatives sometimes lack that confidence, especially because it is a very intimidating environment where everyone throws numbers at you and challenges your thinking. It's not as easy as just presenting something and saying, I believe that will work. People will throw questions back at you. Why would it work and what kind of numbers
Yeah.
and other things should we think about? Can you give maybe an example of how would you pitch, like in real terms, like what numbers would you, let's say it is a rebrand for a large organization, and let's say it's not something that is obvious that kind of has been on everyone's mind. So it is a big project, requires big investment. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of decision making. It will take a lot of time and resource. How would you pitch something like that to a very busy leadership team that actually would prefer not to do anything and just stay where they
Yeah.
are?
Well, I think in the example that you give, if you're pitching that and no one has identified that there's a problem there in the first place, you're probably not going to succeed, right? I mean, most of the time, I would say when you're pitching at that level, you've got to be solving a problem that is known inside of the business. Now, it may be a problem that you have identified that others are not aware of. That can happen sometimes. But generally speaking, well, always the solutions you are bringing have got to be the solution to something that is a real problem, right? I mean, rebrands get talked about extensively, right? Because the general assumption in the world about any rebrand is that it's a waste of money. It didn't need to be done. We'd have been just as well to not do it. But actually, every single major rebrand that happens because there's a significant problem that exists inside of a business. And that problem might be to do with audiences and their perceptions of the organization, the brand. It might be to do with talent and their motivations, either to remain in the firm or participate inside of the firm, or for talent to join. It may be due to other external factors. It may be due to corporate structures and changes that are imminent there. But there's almost always a business problem. So and that's, I think, where you've got to start with anything that you're going to pitch. If you're going to pitch an idea, know what it is that you're solving for. If it's not a problem, but it's 100% an opportunity, then be very clear about what that opportunity is. The other thing I would say with that is, look, that, finance is a tough language, and you'll get nowhere in business if you do not have the language of finance somewhere inside of your lexicon, right? You've got to have that somewhere. Doesn't mean you have to do it yourself. Find yourself an ally. Find yourself somebody. And I mean, finance teams are great because mostly they're desperate to do something interesting, right? I mean, the finance people are very often the most creative people in the company because they're very good at processing the kind of linear systems. And not all of that, by the way, is as linear as one might imagine. But if you go and you find a friendly person inside of your finance organization and you say, here is something that I want to propose. I believe that this is going to work for the following reasons. I need someone to help me and support me in putting together the business case for that. You may find someone that can help you do that, someone who does understand the language of the P&L, someone who does understand the language the board and the leadership team are talking, and bring them on board as your ally. And, I think allyship there's one trick I learned with presenting to a board is you should never ever present anything to a board. And I'm specifically talking at a board there where the answer could possibly be no. The trick to presenting at a board is that the answer is yes before you've even presented, because you've done the pre-work. You need to lobby. You need to get people on board. You need to do one-to-ones with with the majority of people who sit on the board. You need to convince people. And then by the time you present to the board presentations are almost always it should be like a rubber stamp presentation. If you go in and hit a board cold and say, here's an idea you never thought of, you never imagined that I'd be here presenting this today, it won't succeed. But if you go in and you've done your preparation, you've built your business case, you've lobbied, you've brought people on board, there'll still be 3 people out of 10 around the table who won't agree. But if 7 of them do, and then they put it to a vote, then you'll get your way. So I think those 2 things: build allies, do your prep work, be confident in your business case, and you have every chance of success.
This is brilliant advice. I love that you focus on a very human element of decisions, which is, at the end of the day, board members, CEOs, whoever they are humans, and they don't want to be put on the spot to make an important decision that potentially then will affect lots of things that they in charge of. So I think prepping that and kind of having one-on-one conversations, I feel like, again, it's a very much a design process. for any designer should be natural of doing your research and having this. It's almost like user interviews where you might actually find some interesting information from these different members about what actually matters to the business at the moment and how you can tweak your messaging and overall things that you're presenting to make sure it's aligned with overall vision.
Exactly. No, I think that's right. I think there's a tendency among creative people sometimes to kind of be very, very good at like collaborating together, but then almost there's a siege mentality that goes on. It's like a form of Stockholm syndrome that goes on with creative people, that they imagine that they're sort of slightly held captive by the rest of the organization. But if they all hold together and don't complain too much, then they'll probably be all right. I mean, the sort of psychological definition of Stockholm syndrome is to mistake a lack of abuse for an act of kindness. And I think that happens very often in creative people. That like if everybody leaves us alone and we sort of nobody shouts at us, then we're kind of okay. Actually, that's not the way forward. I mean, creative people are amazing collaborators. The best collaborators in the business will be the creative people, right? All you got to do is extend those arms of collaboration to other people inside of the business. And I imagine almost every creative person who's been part of a collaborative process at some point has had somebody as part of that process who wasn't a creative, right? And that the contribution of that person has probably been amazing, right? There's so many times I've seen solutions come out where someone says, oh yeah, that was somebody from finance, or that was somebody from the talent team, or that was someone from sales that came up with that idea. And so just take that attitude, create a wide collaboration, build broad allyship, and yeah, go from there. Take the skills you have naturally as a creator, but don't get yourself stuck in that siege mentality. Don't suffer from Stockholm syndrome.
Love this advice. And I would also love to hear, I suppose, from the agency or external perspective, or consultant perspective, because I think when you're in the organization, it's a bit easier to do all of this pre-work and get these conversations. We recently had a former CMO of Etsy and Miro and kind of lots of wonderful organizations. And she was saying that when an agency presents, so to her as a CMO, what would help is when an agency doesn't just present the big kind of concept and everything and the ideas, but also adds a 3-slide summary deck that she can then, as a CMO, take to the boardrooms, to other people that she needs to sell into. Do you have any perspective also on what are practical things that, especially if you are an external person, if you're an agency consultant, anyone coming externally into these leadership conversations, what kind of things can you do to, again, make it more of a success, whatever you're presenting?
Well, that's one great piece of advice already, right? That your previous conversation had yielded, because that's one thing to remember as an agency, that you go in as an agency and usually imagine, this is the most important thing that everybody here is going to be talking about today. It's not. It's probably the 10th most important thing they're going to be talking about. Maybe not 10th most important, but it'll be the 10th thing that they're doing during the day that has a high priority attached to it, right? So everybody else or everyone you're talking to has a lot of other things they've got to focus on. And what you're proposing is just one thing inside of a large organization. So I think understanding context is really important. It's why that prep work about really understanding what are the drivers for whichever assignment you've been given? What are the drivers for that internally? And are we really sure that what we're proposing as a solution solves that problem or addresses that problem that we've been set? So I think that's important. Understanding that context is really important. I mean, there's so many times I would present things and you think, oh, that was the most amazing presentation I've ever made. How can they not take that idea? And then like weeks would go by and you're like, I haven't heard from them. What's going on? And you'd be calling them saying like, and it wouldn't be that they weren't interested in the idea or that the idea was in any way not right. It would just be that other things overtook them in terms of priority. So I think, yes, being clear about the context in which you're operating, asking your client, how can I help you internally? When you're an agency, very often, you're serving two clients, really. You're serving the organization that has hired you, and you're serving the person that has hired you. And the person that has hired you, by the way, is often at great risk in that situation. They're spending the company's money on you. They've got no guarantee. They've had to champion internally. They can't be in a situation where it fails or it doesn't work. They've got a lot of management of other people to do internally. So always working with them, asking them, how can I help you? What do you need to make this succeed is going to be an extremely important part of it. But as I say, context is everything. You are not the only thing on the agenda of your client. You very often, we would find our clients would say to us frequently, they would say, "You're not the only thing I'm doing right now, but it's the most fun thing," you know? And that's a really nice thing to be able to lean into. Like very often, I think it's worth remembering that when you're hired in as an agent, I mean, just as another point, I was just back to your earlier point. I mean, I used to say half my career, but slightly less than half my career. I spent about sort of 15, 16, 17 years client side. And I worked for some great brands. I worked for Levi Strauss. I worked for Converse. There were some great companies in there. And then I went to the agency side. I always maintain you get listened to much more when you're in the agency because you're being paid for your advice. When you're in the room and someone's paying you an hourly rate to tell them what you think, they listen to you a lot more than when you just turn up in the meeting and you say, "Hey, I got an idea," and they're like, "Yeah, there he goes again with this like kind of crazy creative thought." So there's a lot you can lean into from the agency side. When someone hires you, they want your opinion. That's the first thing, and so always make sure your opinion is interesting. There's nothing worse than an opinion that is bland and boring. Too many agencies make the mistake of just turning up to their clients and giving them an education in things they already know. They don't need like a history of creativity in business. They don't need like 1,000 case studies of what happened for someone else. What they need is what's going to make a difference to me in my business, and what can you bring? Like agencies hire someone when they can't do it themselves. They don't hire someone if they could do it themselves. So you've got to bring something that they can't do themselves. So be ambitious in be realistic in terms of what you can achieve, but don't come with boring. Come with brave, come with different, come with the value add that they need to have. And then yes, work with your client and the individuals internally to support them on their journey as they go through that. But yeah, don't fall into the trap of just trying to repeat what the organization can do for itself.
I love that you brought this point because I do believe right now probably is the most exciting time for creative leaders, creative teams, and designers overall, because creativity has this other things that I suppose businesses never considered as important parts, like, as you said, fun, or looking into the future and understanding what the future might hold, or going into different direction and seeing what's out there. There are so many things that, especially in the world that we live right now, that moves very fast, that you cannot just rely on linear solutions and things that worked yesterday. I think creativity has the most power. And I think businesses expect that from creative teams to bring that instead of kind of more of the same of what worked and what has been happening already, obviously with a layer of understanding the business and the market and everything else, but still this kind of expanded thinking, something they haven't seen before. And also that will be fun, because I do believe we're a bit in a world that is a bit too maybe data driven and rigid, that everyone wants to go to a meeting that is a bit more fun and has
Yeah.
something that will spark your own curiosity and just imagination as well.
Yeah. You make such a good point there. I mean, I think if you go back in time, right? I mean, when I sort of first came into the agency world, it was the early 2000s, 2001, I think. But if you went back in time to around then, sort of mid 1990s, really, let's go all the way back to there first of all. In the prime era of management consultancies, right? The McKinseys, the Deloittes, etc. Right? That was a world in which if you were running a business and you wanted to find some advantage versus your competitors, you would go to McKinsey, because what McKinsey had was knowledge that nobody else had. So McKinsey would say, now we have a forestry and agriculture practice in Asia. And we know there are some learnings from forestry and agriculture in Asia that are directly applicable to your pharmaceutical business in the Americas, right? And that knowledge transference was of value. So you as a CEO would say, oh, that's useful to me. I can buy that. I can rationalize my supply chain on those terms, or I can organize my can structure my organization on those terms. I can do that. So there was very much an era, and it lasted for quite a long time, where the sort of knowledge economy was very much run by the consultants who were able to own that knowledge and then distribute that knowledge and sell that knowledge. That era ended actually some 5 to 10 years ago, at least, when that knowledge had become fully commoditized. Now, there is no advantage to that because anyone who wants that knowledge has already got it. And now it's available on a large language model anyway, so you don't even need McKinsey. You just type it into an AI and you can get the answer. And the incremental advantage that you can get as a business owner today from just transferring knowledge from somewhere in the world to somewhere else in the world is minuscule. Where the advantage is today is in creativity. It's in those leaps of imagination and thought that machines can't make, because famously they can't do that. The advantage is in the brains of creative people who can say, hey, I'm not thinking about what somebody else did. I'm thinking about something that's completely different. I've had an idea that I think could work. So that's why I'm so enthusiastic and positive about the value of creativity and the need for creativity at that senior level, because the knowledge economy is dead and the creative economy is now where the advantage is going to be found. And that is only going to increase in this AI era, because even if you went to you don't even need to go to McKinsey now and spend like 5 million on a deck. You can just go to, an AI and type your question in with the right prompts and you get the same deck at the end of it, half of which will be no more wrong than it was from the consultants anyway. So, so it's a really, really important move that make now more than ever is the creative age, where the difference that gets made to businesses, whether those businesses are large or whether those businesses are just starting up today, is going to come from human ingenuity much more than knowledge.
This is brilliant news, and I love hearing your perspective as well, because you've seen the industries through so many different phases as well, and you've seen creativity at its earlier stage when you had to prove kind of what branding even is, and to the point where now I feel like there is so much understanding and education around it, but there are other challenges that rise. So I love that you see the industry from the same lens, that it is definitely the best time to be creative and do creative work. I would love to move into a next area of discussion, which is about the role of a CEO, because I think it's one of the most mysterious roles overall. And there is no one way to become a CEO. There is no one way to be a CEO. So I always feel like it's such a unique opportunity to talk to a CEO about what does it even feel on the inside? What do you do? How do you make decisions? And what do you think? And obviously you teach in our Design Leaders program how to make decisions as a CEO and how to lead organizations. But would love to pick a few points here in this conversation today, starting with a very kind of day-to-day mundane question. Are there any maybe habits or mindsets or anything that you've got throughout these years of being a CEO that you felt like gave you an unfair advantage overall through your work? So anything that you maybe purposefully practiced or enabled in yourself, any small habits, any mindsets that actually gave you this unfair advantage?
God, well, that's so interesting. I mean, I'm white and male, and that shouldn't be an advantage, but it probably was at a point in my career. But I can't claim that was deliberate. So we'll put that one on one side, and hopefully we're increasingly moving to a world where that no longer is an advantage for people. But I think in terms of behaviors, CEO role is very interesting. I mean, you don't meet many CEOs who set out in life saying, I want to be a CEO when I grow up. Like everyone's as a kid says, I want to be whatever it is, I want to do this or that. I want to be a designer, or I want to be a programmer, or I want to be a fighter or whatever. But, very few people, I suspect we now live where there are generations of people entering the workplace now who do have that ambition to be a CEO, because we have slightly created a cult out of the idea of CEOs. It's become, it was round about the time, I think, that we stopped calling people managing directors and started calling them CEOs. It became slightly sort of mysterious, as you say, that there was this like role that was like a managing director was someone who'd sort of risen their way to the top, whereas a CEO felt like it was, actually a job description and something people trained for. But as I say, today, few CEOs are CEOs because they wanted to be CEOs. They became CEOs because they rose naturally to that position. I mean, the ability to make decisions and the willingness to make decisions is key. That's absolutely the key to being in the CEO chair, because you've got nobody else to do it, really. I mean, everything sort of bubbles up really to CEO, and then something has to be decided. And as consensual as one tries to be in a decision-making process. Ultimately, if you're the CEO, you have to at least chair that process. And you probably in some way have to be the one at some point that says, I decide this or not. And there are so many decisions, those decisions might be huge, big strategic questions, but there aren't so many of those, as a CEO. They happen very rarely, but there'll very often be small things. There'll be things that need to be decided like that. I often tell the story when I'm teaching the program at at the design leaders group that, I used to have time on my diary back in the days when I was running the partners who you mentioned earlier on to discuss the mice in the basement of the office, because we had this terrible problem with mice that would come in the building, and somehow as a CEO that would end up on my desk as have we got the right firm to try and eliminate the mice, and are we going to deal with them humanely, and it's like, not that these questions aren't important, because mice in the office is an unpleasant thing, and poor mice at the end of the day. But, the range of decisions you have to make is huge, and the frequency with which you have to make decisions is huge. So you've got to be prepared to make decisions. If you're somebody that always needs to go to somebody else for a decision, then don't be a CEO. But if you're someone who's comfortable with that, and I think a key to that is not necessarily making a decision and feeling I have to be right, I can't afford to be wrong, because you can never know that. So many decisions you made are made in an imperfect situation with imperfect information. But you've got to make a decision, because it's better to make a decision and it to be wrong very often than not to make a decision and just sort of fall into a sort of state of inactivity. So you've got to be prepared to make decisions and then adapt and adjust as time goes on, to sometimes be able to put your hand up and say, I was wrong. But hopefully more often than not to be right. So I suppose, hard, I was always comfortable with that. I think in every role I ever had, I was always comfortable with making decisions and then working through the consequences. It's not living with the consequences, it's working with the consequences. So I was always comfortable with that. So I suppose that was if there was a superpower, for want of a better word, I'd say it was that decisiveness.
Love it. And you're so right. I feel like the decision making is probably one of the most important skills in any leadership role, and especially when you're a CEO, because so many things depend on that. I wonder, what did you learn about decision making and better decision making? As you said, no one has 100% right decisions all the time, but I suppose the more you do them, the more you learn how to make the right decisions. And I suppose there are two buckets of challenges with decision making. One is your personal state of mind as a human. If you didn't have enough sleep, your decisions won't be as good. If you didn't have time to think about business overall, and you constantly just in kind of this everyday whatever routine, and you just never step back and see the full picture, again, your decisions will be quite limited. So one is on, I suppose, the human stress level. Another one is on a more strategic level. Again, what pieces of information do you need to have? How do you what mental framework do you have for making decisions, or maybe what questions do you ask yourself before making decisions? So let's start with the second part. Like, before you had to make a decision, especially a big one, I don't know if mice in the basement fall under the big one, but let's say it was a big financial decision that will affect a lot of people in a company or a client or something. What kind of mental framework or any questions you would ask yourself before making this decision?
Well, I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, does this decision have to be made, and does it have to be made now? Right? Because not all decisions have to be made at all, and certainly not all decisions have to be made now. So, one of the tricks is to buy yourself enough time to be able to get more information, because a lot of things are presented to you as like, oh, we've got to decide right now. But you think about it, well, we don't have to decide now. We can have a placeholder decision, and then we can roll with that for a while, or we can just have no decision. We can open it up for more discussion. There are lots of different decision-making styles, and some people lead and manage with a much more consensual style. Other people tend to lead much more decisively. Owner-operators, founders of companies very often, lead with a much more, and this was the Apple way, the Steve Jobs way was very much, this is the way we're going to do it, and, like it or leave, right? So some people lead that way. If you're that kind of person, I mean, maybe there are implications on the culture of your company, but, there's clarity around that. And, it's one of the things, this is why decision-making is so important. That one thing that organizations of people hate is indecisiveness. They hate the lack of clarity. The biggest problem you hear from teams all the time, I heard from teams all the time when I was leading, was where people said, we don't know what's happening, or we don't know what the strategy is, or we don't know what's expected of us. People would rather know what's expected of them and not like it, that not know what's expected of them and, avoid the possibility that they wouldn't like it. So, but as I say, I think the starting point for a decision has to be, do I need to make that decision right now? Or have I got more time on that? If you have a decision that needs to be made at that point in time, then yes, you do have to say, what information have I got that can help me to make that decision? The beauty of being a CEO is that you have got access to everything. I mean, you're the most informed person in the company because all information is feeding up to you. And it's actually much easier to make a lot of decisions than people imagine because you've got that information. If you're sitting in one area of the business, if you're a functional leader, the information you have is limited to everything that filters up to you from inside of your function and a little bit of stuff that comes across to you. If you're the CEO, actually, you've got all the information from all of the functions. So everything's feeding in. So you're often much more informed than people imagine. And people will very often come and say, oh, I've got this huge problem. I don't know what to do. I've been wrestling with it for ages. I've tried to think the solution myself, but I really need your help. And you'll simply be able to say, well, I can actually just connect that to something over here that I know is happening, or something that I heard recently, or something that I know is on the mind of this other person inside of the organization. So sometimes it's a lot easier than you imagine. But the second question has to be, what information can I get in order to make that decision quickly? And then, yeah, you make the decision. And as I say, don't make a decision that you can't reverse out of. I mean, there are some decisions you can't reverse out of. And there are times when you've got to make horrible decisions. Anything connected with people that has a negative effect on people is horrible to make. I mean, I don't think even people that would pretend they are okay with those decisions don't like those decisions. Like, nobody likes making a decision that has a negative impact on somebody else's life. But sometimes you have to do that. And sometimes you have to do that for the good of the majority of people inside of the company. When you're inside of a company and it's shrinking and that shrinkage is unsustainable and you have to make redundancies, it's a horrible thing to do. But what you're not doing that to inconvenience and disrupt the lives of the people that are made redundant. You're doing it to protect the futures of the people who remain inside of the organization, and then to be able to regrow and to hire new people and maybe even some of the people back again. There are times when you've got to make some really, really tough decisions. You've got to remain open-minded and adaptable to the future as well. Never lock yourself into something that is, it becomes an insolvable problem for yourself. But as I say, do I have to make the decision? What information is available to me right now? And then how do I make the most of that? Probably the three things.
Love it. I think there was a famous saying from Obama, if I'm not wrong, that if I have more than 60% information on making decisions, it's too late, or something like that. But basically, there is never you never have full information. So you have to make a decision based on what you have. So if you wait too long to gather all the information, then probably
I think that's a great
decision.
one. I always like, there was a quote from Mario Andretti, who was a Formula One driver and then went on to race in the US. And he said at one point, if you think you've got everything under control, you're not going fast enough. And I quite like that idea as well. The sort of the endless wait for perfection is endless. I mean, and perfection is relative to a point in time. I mean, like, what's perfect today, by tomorrow is imperfect anyway. So you've got to be comfortable dealing with the 60% and then adapt to it. Yeah, there are very few decisions that last forever.
That's a great point. So going back to the first part of the question, how do you make sure that you as a human make the right decisions? And especially, as you mentioned, the day of a CEO is very hectic. Day of any senior leader is incredibly hectic. And I do believe that there is a special skill in kind of protecting your time, your energy, your deep thinking. So have you done anything to make sure that your day looks like somehow a sane day where you can make the right decisions? Or do you batch certain decisions on certain days or certain times of the day? Or what do you did you implement maybe from more of a psychological perspective to make sure, or you never make decisions on a Friday because everyone wants to go home, or anything like that that is a bit more on the kind of
Yeah,
our human side?
it was never that deliberate. I mean, I feel I was always quite good at managing my time, and I think prioritization is key in the role. It's know what you have to deal with and know what you don't have to deal with. And a lot of that, I think, is linked to empowerment of others as well. A leader who wants to involve themselves in everything all of the time and wants to be in the room when every decision is made anywhere in the organization is going to struggle for time and probably is going to struggle for the quality of their decisions. But I think a leader who is prepared to trust others to make their decisions and who understands or can find the appropriate balance between those decisions that are left to other people, but those decisions that you want to be involved with, I think that's really important. So I feel I was good at protecting my time, and I became very comfortable with situations where I didn't have anything to do. And, and I think good leaders do that. Good leaders are available when you need them because they're not filling their time with stuff that they don't need to be doing. They recognize that when they're needed, they're needed. And when they're not needed, they're not. And I think that's a really important part of leadership and, not be, I mean, like everybody suffers from some degree of imposter syndrome almost at every level inside of an organization. I mean, almost every CEO looks at themselves in the mirror once a week and says, how did I even get here? And was that an accident? Everybody's asking themselves that question. Nobody has such supreme or very few people have such supreme self-confidence that they wouldn't ever ask that question of themselves. But I think, you have to be comfortable with where you are. But yes, protect your time, be there when people need you. My style was very much dialogue with people. I got so much more out of saying, I will talk to the key people in my leadership team and others as well. But I will talk to people once a week or more, once a day, sometimes with some people, once every other day. And we'll have a conversation, even if we've got nothing to talk about, we've got no agenda, we'll have a chat and we'll see where we are. Because I think so much gets done through that. Decisions don't have to be set piece moments. They can be made incrementally over time. It's back to my thing about never present to a board where the answer could never ask a question where the answer could possibly be no, right? By the time a decision is due, you should know what you need to do without having to sit down and say, oh my word, I've got to make a decision now. That your goal should be to avoid that situation. When the decision is due, it's naturally fallen into place. It all
Oh,
sounds so simple, but it's just theory, of course. But
I love the feeling that you kind of describe, that you should have more free time and flexibility. How do you do it on a practical level? So did you have days that are protected with no meetings? Because I think one thing that anyone in the office, I have to say, but especially CEOs and leaders, are dangerously sometimes victims of are the meetings, the meetings that you should be part of, the meetings you should attend, any sort of call. So how, when your day fills with all of that, where do you find time for everything else? Or what did you do to make sure you are not involved? I think you already mentioned delegation and kind of
yeah.
making sure that you know and everything, which is it's a great way. But was there anything else that, I don't know, you decided Fridays, I don't allow anyone to book meetings, I'm free for everyone, that's when I have conversations, or mornings is my coffee time, or whatever?
Yeah, no,
Anything like that.
it is a good, I mean, there definitely is an art to saying I'm not going to the meeting. And I mean, the great thing, again, when you're the CEO, you can decide that, right? If you're not the CEO and you say, I'm not going to the meeting, the CEO tells you to go to the meeting. When you're the CEO and you say, I'm not going to that meeting, you guys need to sort that out yourself. Then that's easy to do. But I think tips, now what I would try, so I talked about these catch up calls that I would have with people. And as much as possible, I tried to do those at the beginning of the week, like Monday and Tuesday, so I would say they will be almost like my conversation days. It was a bit like a doctor's surgery at times, whether physically or virtually. It would be like, you come in, we sit down, we chat for half an hour. I mean, I didn't have a desk in my office. I had a sofa in my office because why did I need a desk? I was sitting talking to people. I didn't need to be sitting there I had a desk somewhere else that I could, if I needed to sit and type emails, I could do that. I mean, by the way, the tyranny of email is something to try and avoid as well. Just try and push as much of the dialogue you have with people to being in person. I learned a lot from people at one point. As a brilliant, brilliant company who many of you will have heard of, called Lambinaire, founded by Martin Lambinaire, that was part of WPP. And I took over running. I was running the partners, and I took over running Lambinaire simultaneously. So I was running these two businesses. Ultimately, I merged the two of them together and some other firms to create Superunion, because it made no sense to have separate companies. But everybody in Lambinaire was brilliant, because the culture in Lambinaire was that people would just call you, in an era where everyone else was email. In Lambinaire, like, your phone would ring at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and somebody would say, "Oh, Jim, it's Adrian. I just thought I'd ring you to ask you about, something." And I love that, because there's, that spontaneity. It's so much quicker to get things done by conversations. If you want to make more time for yourself, go have more conversations with people, and say to people, don't email me. If you have a question, ring me. And if I don't get back to you, fine, send me an email. But so I think things like that happen. But I did try to do conversations sort of Monday, Tuesday, try to hold open Wednesday, Thursday. I was running global companies, you travel a lot. And part of the reason I tried to compress the calls into the early part of the week was because it freed me up to be able to travel without having to reschedule everybody, every week. So some of that was that. But, some of it's just, a lot of it actually is just about knowing who you are and how you want to work. That's what worked for me. It might not work for other people. So know who you are, know what you're comfortable with. And, I mean, you made the point, Ekaterina, which I think is so important, which is at the end of the day, we are all human beings, and we've all got limitations. And the idea that other people have powers and abilities that are superior to ours is completely false. That we're all limited. The people who, a lot of it's about preference, and there are some things about willingness to do stuff, but people who are senior in organizations, generally speaking, have become comfortable with who they are and how they like to work, and then they stick to that formula. So I think anybody should, but anyone who starts by saying, who am I? How do I like to work? What works for me? Stick to that, and you'll go a long way with that.
This is a brilliant advice. And I feel like you're so right. We often forget that we cannot copy someone else's operational system to make it work for us. No matter how many podcasts we listen and books we read about successful people, at the end of the day, we need to understand who we are and how we operate, and how to get the most out of our own brains, creativities, productivity, and everything else.
Yeah.
Speaking of understanding yourself, how would you deal with a difficult situation? Or there are days in anyone's work, and I'm sure in CEO's work especially, they're just horrible. There is just lots of maybe bad things happen. It's a dark day. It's a dark day in your life, in your company's life. How did you, first of all, do you remember any of these dark days? Maybe you can not spare some of the details, but just describe what happened. And how did you get yourself out of that state that potentially would hold you back from moving on or making the right decisions or anything else?
Yeah, well, what a great question. There were lots of those days, and I spent 20 years really as a CEO. And when you can't go through 20 years and not have periods where things aren't going great, I think I probably had 17 where they were going great, as an average. But even in that, the 3 that weren't, where the business goes backwards, where you have to restructure, reorganize, you have a big client, you lose a client, and you're only in control of so much in our world, right? You have this sort of macroeconomic thing. I was a CEO through the financial crisis in 2008-9. I was a CEO, obviously, through COVID. So you get these periods of time where, you just have to deal with really difficult things, really tough things. How do you get through it? I mean, you have to create some separation in your mind, I think, between business, which is what it is, and you as a human being, and you and your life. You have to be able to go home and say, okay, that was a bad day. I think, most people are capable of doing that, right? And I mean, like, it's not like anyone can go home and switch off completely. Everyone's going to have times when they're going to go home and think, that was awful. And, they're going to get out the box of tissues and have a little cry. I mean, that's like a normal thing to do. I don't think I did it that often, but I probably did it sometimes. And, I think the important thing is, how do you bounce back? Right? The important thing is, how do you bounce back? And I was always a great believer in vision and ambition and goals, like to be able to come back from a difficult moment and then to reaffirm to yourself and to the company and to the people around you, this is why we're here. This is what we're trying to do. My ambition in the agency world was always, we want to build the most creative agency in the world. We never, I don't know how you'd measure that. I don't know where we ever were on a scale of success with that at different times with different companies. There are times when we thought we found measures that said we were, but there'd be other measures that said we weren't. But we always had that to go back to. There was always this North Star that when things weren't good, you could come back and you could say, okay, we've had a tough time for these reasons that we can control and these reasons we can't control. We've had to make these decisions that we don't like to make. This has been really difficult. I know it's awful, but let's talk about why we're here. Let's talk about where the road goes from here. Let's talk about why we made those decisions, because they fit with that context of where we want to get to. So I think for me, vision and ambition and consistency of that and authenticity of that is really, really important. Back to where we started this conversation, how do you make creativity more important in business? You'll never make it more important in an organization that believes in it for a day and then forgets about it the next day, right? And it is a problem in organizations, creativity often sits under the remit of a CMO, and then CMO's there for 2 years and then they leave and a new CMO comes in and the new CMO says, creativity, forget it. It's all about data, so that's problematic, right? But I think when you're running organizations and you get to set the vision, set it, repeat it, keep referring back to it, because that is, I think, what will get you through those dark days you described.
I love that you talked about focusing on North Star and actually looking at something positive and kind of focusing on what we can do and really putting all the energy that is sometimes left, which is not much, but putting it towards something positive instead of getting pulled into all the negative things that can be happening and potentially are happening in any company, in any team at some point. So I love the idea of going back to the vision, going back to the positive, why we're here, what we're trying to do. I have a few other things that I wanted to talk to you about, Jim, which is to do with kind of the wisdom you accumulated throughout the years. And you already mentioned a few things that you saw the changes of. And I feel like, again, it is so important for all of us to reflect of how far we've gone or where the industry is going. Sometimes it's very easy to be in the now and what's happening and everything is going wrong or everything is going right and get slightly over obsessed with the current state of everything. So a few questions about the industry that you've seen throughout the years. So one is about the role of design, again, in this metaphorical boardroom and within the senior leadership teams, or design and creativity. Again, I personally see them as one. Some people might debate that, but design and creativity at senior leadership level. What have you seen changed throughout these years in a positive and a negative way, or anything that I suppose would be useful for design leaders to know, especially for those who potentially want to become chief design officers and kind of have that seat at the table with design? What have you seen maybe changed in any way?
Well, I think what the first part of that goes back to that point I was making about the knowledge economy versus the creative economy, and I think that really is a significant change. So it's almost you wouldn't really imagine a chief design officer role in a lot of organizations back 15, 20 years ago, whereas you could totally imagine that in every organization now, because there genuinely is a recognition that design, and I agree. Design and creativity are difficult terms because nobody can give you an agreed definition of what either of them mean, right? Whereas so many other disciplines in business, you probably could. So they're tricky, but they're certainly interchangeable terms, I think, for the purpose that we're discussing here. So I think that's one change. I think the flip side of that, organizations become incredibly political more and more as time has gone on, as the stakes rise and the way that success, and the larger the organization, the more that's the case because of the way that they're measured and their performance is measured. Performance isn't really measured by actually how popular is your product, how many customers have you got, do people like you, and it's not even measured by how well did you do in the last year or the last quarter or the last week. It's measured by how a bunch of analysts believe you might do in the 3 to 6 months that follow relative to the 3 to 6 months that have gone past. So there's this sort of very sort of false kind of set of measurements that exist in businesses. So they make organizations, as I said earlier, quite risk averse sometimes and quite difficult to deal with. So there's an interesting juxtaposition there, I think, of concepts of like design has never been more important, but on the other hand, it's harder and harder to break through in terms of those organizations. Although, as I said also before, I mean, everybody in the organization suffers with that same problem. So that's not a problem that's unique to design. It applies to finance, it applies to sales, it applies to the talent function, it applies to, every other part of the organization in equal measure. I mean, I felt very, very positive, certainly a couple of years ago, about the way that organizations had changed from, when I started my career, they were brutal. I mean, you like everybody yelled at you. I mean, you had to deliver like perfectly 100% of the time and work an 18-hour day. And then, back to my Stockholm syndrome thing, you might not get shouted at, but could be brutal organizations. I think organizations have changed a lot to be much more accommodating of humanity and much more appreciative of the need for us to value people as individuals and treat people as individuals. And that has to be a good thing, because what that does is it gives voice to different opinions. It gives space for creativity, and it gives room for people who have diversity of thought. And I think when we talk about diversity in terms of organization, what we're really aiming for is diversity of thought and experience. And when we get that, the organizations are better. So I think organizations have become better at that. I worry slightly that, like 2 years ago, I was super optimistic about that. And now I'm sort of slightly like, I really don't want that reset button to be pressed any harder than it already has been. And I don't think it will be. I mean, I think, again, the optimist, as you can probably tell by now, I mean, I'm ridiculously optimistic all the time, but I think one has to be. But I believe there's a generation of leaders emerging now. The next generation of senior leaders, or current going into next generation of senior leaders going into CEO, are naturally going to create companies and operate companies that have fabulous culture at their heart and that really celebrate and embrace people as themselves. And that will create a better environment in which everyone can do their best work. So those are the things that I think have changed really and continue to change. I mean, technology is so interesting because, so much. I started working when, the best way to send a message somewhere far away was a fax, right? And that was like new. It was like, oh my word, there's a fax. We can send a fax. You go through so many technology changes over time. I think it's always interesting that the expectation we have of how much the world is going to change in the future is always slightly more exaggerated than what actually happens. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that everyone was saying that the metaverse was going to transform the way we do business. And now no one cares about the metaverse. And then it was blockchain is going to transform the way we do business. And now no one really cares about blockchain. And now AI is going to transform the way we do business. And all of them are going to have some impact, but whether any of them quite have the impact that we imagine now, I don't know. And yet somehow when you look back in time, the degree of change that we hadn't necessarily anticipated is actually enormous. So there are these amazing transformations that happen all the time. We're just not very good at predicting them, in my opinion. So the future will be very different. It just won't be the different we expect. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. I mean, I think in the sort of AI world, as soon as people get off the sort of conversation about I'm talking about AI because I feel I should do, as opposed to I'm talking about AI because I genuinely have identified a way it can help, then I think we'll be better for that. So yeah, those would be probably my main observations.
I love both of those points. And I love that you mentioned the humanity of businesses, and that's where you see businesses moving. And I haven't seen 30 years of industry like you've done or more, but even in my chunk of time, I can see how the culture of companies changed. And expectations of what does it mean to run a company or be part of the company changed. And I think this is, I agree, it's a beautiful, beautiful change that benefits all of us. And I do believe it is actually directly linked to the first point of our conversation of design and creativity at the leadership level, because again, designers and creatives are the ones who trained or in empathy or naturally empathic and curious, and they kind of bring this lens that maybe hasn't been a traditional financial metric, but something that is very natural to a lot of creative people, this connection, this kind of creativity, collaboration, and all these other things. So I do believe that if we push more creative and design and leaders into leadership roles, we only see more of this positive change. And I would love to go as far to say that we need more creatives in governments as well, and in just in general wider society, because I do believe that they bring so much, so many other skills that are just not valued enough currently in our society, but actually are beneficial to everyone. It's not that it's either creativity or financial performance. It's actually great creativity brings great financial performance, great culture, great empathy, great human relationship, create efficiency, create great companies that attract the best talent and do the best business. So it's never one or another. And I love that you highlighted this as a positive change overall, because I do believe that I'm also an optimist, as you can see,
no,
and I hope it's not
we
people
need
enough.
them. No, I think it's such a good point. I mean, the mistake that happens in government, of course, is every time they hire someone from the creative industries, they hire someone from like a PR firm to
We need
to
to
to,
define
to
what we mean by creativity.
yeah. I mean, well, that's sort of back to the vagueness of it. And by the way, I mean, there's some brilliant, brilliant people working in PR firms. It's just that the role in government tends to end up being how can I create a messaging strategy that deflects from the truth, right? I mean, government, it's such a tough area. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, we need more kind of, behavioral economics and more thinking about that. But that's, yeah.
But it also goes back to what, again, we as Future Academy keep saying, like, yes, you need to be creative, but you need to understand the business and everything else, and geopolitics and operations and everything else. So again, whoever out of, any creatives that are listening to this who want to go in the government, please also be backed with all the other skills that you need to survive there and make the right decisions, because in those environments, and again, whether it is leadership in companies or in the world overall, we need creativity, but then you also need other skills to make sure you can implement this creativity and actually for everyone to benefit from it. So I still do believe we need more push for that, but I suppose balancing it with all the other skills. And the second point, I love that you obviously mentioned AI, and I love that you kind of mentioned the overall scale of change that we can never predict. And I think there is a lot of anxiety about AI and creativity and where will it go. And we've seen so many changes and shifts in the platforms. And the question is really like, how can we all move to this new direction? So what, I suppose, to summarize many, many questions that have been submitted about the role of AI and AI and creativity, what do you think AI will change in the future? Or what do the CEOs or creatives should think about in the world of AI right now, from your perspective? Again, no one knows the right answer, but from what you've seen, how should we all think about AI? What do you think is the most valuable way
Yeah.
to think about it?
Yeah, well, again, it's such a big question. I mean, I think the whole discussion around AI that exists in the world today is at risk of trying to put so much into this one big bucket with just two letters at the top of it, right? It's like AI has become this like kind of little verbal device for like anything connected to technology. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff we talk about with AI, which you could say, well, actually, that's been around, since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, there's the process of automation of certain things is not the same as creating something that is genuinely additive to the world, in that it can do something that couldn't be done before, right? So first of all, I think there's got to be a separation made in the creative industries and the debate around that between, are we talking about technologies that are simply about being able to do the same things slightly faster, or even sometimes significantly faster and significantly cheaper, right? That's one thing. And a lot of big companies in the creative industries, I think, are getting far too caught up in the idea of let's find a way to do things faster and cheaper. And that I'm not sure I necessarily think that's AI. That's just technology and the deployment of technology. I think there's another conversation that says, are there ways in which we can take advantage of the sophistication and processing capabilities of AI that allow us to create solutions that could not exist without them? Right. And again, there's a difference there between saying there's a way to craft something into existence through prompts instead of having to ask a human being to actually produce it, right? Which again is a technology solution, versus is there a way that we can get better solutions to problems because they're driven by AI? And again, there's the difference between large language models that are really just processing vast sources of information to get you to sometimes some quite dubious solutions versus technologies that really are about solutions that couldn't otherwise exist. So when somebody is able to sort of unpick the DNA or the structure of a specific type of cancer using AI and develop a solution for it, that is a problem being solved by AI. That's completely different to somebody saying, oh yeah, we've got a platform where if you want an ad with, somebody eating a chocolate bar, we can produce it for you in 3 nanoseconds. So those two things are completely different. So I would say, the focus on AI for creative people really should be, what can we do with AI that we couldn't have done with human beings? And if that is, it could have been done with human beings, but it would have taken 1,000,000 years, and therefore it was impractical. That's okay. And really that's all it's ever going to be. But anyway, but I think but that's where the focus has got to be, is how do we create things that are new, that are different, that are additive? I don't think really clients are out there saying, I need a solution that is driven by AI. What clients are saying is, I need a solution is better than any one that I've had before and better than anything else that's out there. And if AI is your solution to that, go for it. People can't do is ignore it, right? Any creative, it depends where you are in your career, right? I mean, the older you get, the harder it is to learn new stuff, but don't stop learning new stuff. If you have the opportunity to go and learn more about some specific applications or uses of AI or ways to engage with AI, take it. And then you can choose whether or not it's relevant or not down the line. But yeah, let's be focused on where it adds value, not just on where it saves time. There's going to be a very, very lucrative world out there for some people, saving time and saving money. It's just, I don't think those are necessarily creative people who are going to profit from that. Or, they may be, but they'll be abandoning their creativity along the way.
These are great points, and if anyone is interested in more AI conversations, we actually have the whole series coming up about AI tools and design and creativity, and how the leading companies are currently trying to figure out what is the best collaboration between AI and design. So we'll dive into that there, but let's pick a few questions for Jim about leadership and the role of CEO and all these wonderful challenges that seems like we always creative community share. Celia is asking, when you want to hold a creative workshop with senior leadership, a group that does not want to be put on the spot, be confronted with decisions, what is a good way to break through that barrier? Open up the space? How would you organize it? How would you get them on board and have them actively participate? So senior leadership who don't want to be involved.
I love that question. So I used to do that kind of thing a lot, actually, with senior leaders. I think the trick to it was always to give them scenarios that they can react to. So if you go into a room and you've just got like a whiteboard and a pen, and you say, right, let's brainstorm. It's going to fail. They don't know how to behave in that environment. They're not comfortable in that environment. It'll be stilted. It'll be really difficult. If you go in and you say, so one thing we used to do a lot when we were talking about sort of we were talking about brand strategy, and to some extent the design solutions that would spin off the back of that. We would go into an organization and we would say, we have painted 3 different views of the future of your organization, looking 5 to 10 years into the future. we give it a name, and we visualize what the company would look like based on different strategic scenarios. So we might have one scenario that would focus more on, let's say, the deployment of technology. And we would say, imagine that you became a leader in the technology space in your industry. This is the kind of product mix you would have. This is the kind of conversations you'd be having in the marketplace. This is the kind of advertising you'd produce. This is the kind of culture you would be promoting internally. This is what would be written about you in the newspapers. And then we'd present another scenario that would say, imagine you focused more on building the world's best culture for your employees. This is what that would look like. And then we'd usually do three. And we called the process triangulation because we saw it as being rather like the way that you can triangulate between masts in a cell phone network. So, basically got three different posts that are at the sort of outer limit of where you could go. Somewhere inside of that triangle lies where you are. And what senior leaders love in that situation is being able to react to something that looks tangible and feels real. And they can imagine themselves there, and they can say, oh, well, I like that bit of it, but I wouldn't want to be like that. And no, we'd never do that. That wouldn't be right for us. But I love that bit from over there. And you could almost literally put yourself somewhere inside the triangle at the end of it. We would literally ask people to put a mark inside of a triangle where they wanted to be. And there's always someone in the workshop that puts the mark outside the triangle, which extra creative points for that person. That's the creative person in the frustrated creative in the senior leadership team. So that would be my advice. Give specific scenarios, even if they're imagined, and let them react to it. And then the imagination will start to flow. Don't go in and start with a blank piece of paper.
This is such a brilliant advice. And I feel like this is, again, a very unique skill that creatives and designers have to visualize the intangible. And there are so many conversations that senior leadership team can have about strategy and this and that. But I think suddenly seeing, as you said, a piece of newspaper with a headline or something that is tangible suddenly gets such a straightforward reaction that sometimes cannot be captured in so many conversations. And I feel like the leadership teams love when this finally happens, when everyone can get aligned and on board about something that has been kind of vague.
100%. We did. I remember doing it once when we did this a lot. We used to pitch like that as well very often. Go in and say, okay, we're not going to tell you what the answer to your problem is, but we're going to give you three possible directions. And then, you'll be somewhere in the middle. But I remember for a very large global drinks company at one point who were looking to restructure part of their organization and create a new division that would be focused on really the sort of top end portfolio, the luxury end of their portfolio, which included the top end of some very famous brands in that. And we wrote them, and this was actually for the board, we wrote a magazine from the perspective of the future that imagined that they had done it. And we wrote 30,000 words of original copy. And I think I personally wrote about 22,000 words of it in a week. And they were all articles, like as if it was in a magazine. And it was one of the favorite bits of work that we ever did. And the board signed it off. They had a board meeting in a hotel somewhere, 8 a.m. in the morning. The little magazines were slipped under the door of each of the board meetings. So they were all reading, and they came down to the table. And again, pre-selling for the board meeting was done. They were all, they all loved the idea. So yeah, definitely give them something to react to.
Such a beautiful story. Love it. Shivam is asking, how do you balance between the creativity and business decisions? Like, how do you make sure that you are making your organizational decisions, not just as a business owner, but as a creative individual as well? Is running a business would lead you towards a road that's less creative and imaginative, but more analytical and factual?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think, and so cards on the table, I never trained as a creative, right? I'd count myself as being a creative person, and I've done a lot of work that I suppose would earn the title of being, creatively okay. But I never trained in that. I mean, I started my career in the textile industry, like managing production in factories. And then I moved into product line management, and then I moved into marketing, and then I moved into sort of brand consulting and design. So, and I had this big advantage in that I was never pigeonholed. So, especially when you get in the agency world, agencies are terrible at saying, are you a creative or are you a client person or are you are you a strategist even, which was kind of the worst of everything, which is kind of where I did start. But I think the answer to the question that you're asking is don't allow yourself to be pigeonholed, right? Don't see those things as separate. Don't see creative decisions and business decisions as being different. You're running a business and it's a creative business, or you're running a business creatively. Creativity and business are two things that you are intertwining together in your mind and in your approach and in your own personal style. And the trick is to keep those things together. And so when you're faced with the decision, sometimes you will make a decision that is going to be driven more by business factors and won't much of an element of creativity in it. At other times it will. But you just have to judge it on a case by case basis. I think in terms of running a company and making sure that you don't erode the creativity inside of the company because you've got to because of the needs of the business is a slightly different question. And another really, really important question. You have to, if your company's product is creativity, you have to protect it. I mean, that's what's going wrong in a lot of marketing services holding companies right now, is they're having conversations about how do we simplify the structure of the group? How do we deploy technology and AI? They're not having conversations about how do we protect and enhance the creativity of our product. And that's what they need to do. So if that is your business, then absolutely, you've got to put that front and center. That's back to vision. If that's the kind of company you are, do not let the business overtake that. The only way you can have a strong creative business is if there's a strong business underneath it. So you've got to run a good business, but it's a delicate balancing act, but one you've got to strive to make.
Wow, this was a wonderful answer, and I felt like it touched on so many points that, again, every creative and designer can identify themselves with, whether they are the business owner or just try to always make decisions that have analytical part and have the creative part. But I love that, again, we should all be focused on, if creativity is the main thing that we produce and that we actually focus on as a company, then it should be front of center of our decision making, of our culture, of everything else that we do. We are running out of time, so I wish we had another hour to dive into so many conversations, but for the lucky people who are joining our executive program for design leaders, they'll have more time with Jim, learning all the wisdom of decision making at the C level and just the difficult but very important role of a CEO. But I would love to finish with one last question that we ask everyone who comes on our podcast, which is a bit of a philosophical question. If you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably possible to get quite philosophical about that, but it's got to be the elimination of war and conflict, right? It's got to be. I mean, somehow it's so interesting how everything we've been talking about here is relationship that exists between humanity and human ingenuity and collaboration and optimism. And so many people, like the vast majority of people in the world, share that, right? The vast majority of people in the world share that. I mean, maybe the optimism goes up and down a little bit sometimes, but, there's a fundamental kindness in almost all people. And yet somehow we end up in a world that is so wrought with this anger and this tension that then manifests itself in these horrendous acts of violence. And I don't think there's anything else I could answer the question right now that says I would have to, I would change that. You would have to, I don't know how you change that, but at the highest possible level, we have to find a way to just become cohesive entity in the world of people who respect each other. And look, I know we almost got into politics at one point, Ekaterina, and that is like so hard, right? I don't envy anyone who gets into that, because what we're talking about is not really solvable. But in the idealistic environment that we are in right now, and in response to the question that you asked, peace is the answer.
I sign up for that and definitely agree that we should be more human, empathic and curious. And I think that's what leads to more of us understanding each other, and actually being able to live as one on this wonderful planet. There's only one planet that we have. So we should better get along with each other. Thank you so much, Jim. It was such a pleasure having you and learning from your wisdom, as always, providing the depth that just unlimited. And I feel like we can go into so many different avenues every time, and very practical and very knowledgeable in so many areas. And again, combining these wonderful worlds of creativity and business in one brain in a very holistic way without deciding whether to choose one or another. And I just have so much admiration for what you've done and also how you think. So thank you so much for sharing this time with us and sharing your wisdom with our community.
Well, you're far too kind, but thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a really great pleasure. And thanks for all of the work you do, Ekaterina, to support and promote design and creativity in this world, because that's so important. And I'm in awe of everything that you do.
Very kind of you, Jim. Thank you so much. Thanks again for joining. And until next time, bye.
Bye, everyone.